we talk about law-gospel distinction, right? Gospel is story plus promise, right? Is how we define it in our hermeneutics class. Story plus promise plus story, right? It's what God has done. And I'd encourage you, when it comes to more explicit calls, more explicit evangelistic calls in contexts like this, I don't think they're inappropriate. But let's make sure we're doing it in a way that amplifies the story of what God has done, right? And that our hope is found in Jesus Christ and in Him alone. And one of your roles as a pastor in situations like this is to model, to lead not only with your words, but to lead with your emotions as well. Because truly, people are in a vulnerable state in which they don't know how to feel. People do not know how to feel at funerals. And you need to show them what it looks like to feel rightly. The way you stand, the way you say your words, the way you do everything. They're looking to you for emotional leadership as well as biblical leadership. Biblical meaning from the Scripture. In one sense, though, and we'll talk about this more when we preach, when does application start when you preach? When do you start applying the text?
When we start.
From the moment you get up there. From the moment you stand up, you're applying the text. Because people start to see what it looks like for these realities you're talking about to affect a person. And what they should see is what a life transformed by these realities looks like. And so when you lead emotionally in difficult and transitional situations like this, people can observe, okay, that's how I'm supposed to feel. They might not say it like that, but that's what they take away. That's what I'm supposed to feel. That's how I'm supposed to think about this. That's how I'm supposed to conduct myself. And you really do lead people, even when you don't make explicit calls for them to do something. Right? There's implicit calls for them to feel certain ways and to respond in certain ways to the situation. Does that make sense? Good. Let's go ahead and make a transition then to the theme of covenant. The theme of covenant in the Bible. I make the argument in our hermeneutics class that the theme of covenant is like a skeleton in the Bible, right? So how does the skeleton function for our bodies? The skeleton provides the structure, so that without a skeleton, it's just almost a glob of nothing, right? You take a skeleton out of a body, and they just kind of lay there on the floor in a puddle. And that's kind of, I think that's a good illustration for how the biblical storyline feels apart from the theme of covenant. Apart from the theme of covenant, it's hard to even discern a primary storyline in the Bible. The covenants drive the biblical storyline forward. They show us what our expectations should be. And sometimes those expectations are disappointed. Sometimes they're met. Sometimes we're told to wait. Without the promises of God delivered through covenant, it's hard to really know what we're supposed to expect on the next page of the Bible. If the story of the Bible is the story of God, we said, redeeming a people for Himself to enter a relationship with them for His own glory, or if the story of the Bible is, I will be their God and they will be my people, the way that that's done in the Bible is through covenant. Apart from covenant, there's no, I will be your God, you will be my people reality. Which brings us back to covenant as a reality that's necessary, not even before the fall, or not even after the fall, but before it. When we talked in our prolegomena class about how revelation is necessary, not primarily because of our moral failures, but because of ontology, because of the way God designed us, because of the creator-creature distinction, right? God is unapproachable. He's invisible. He dwells in unapproachable light. And if we are to know anything about God, God must first reveal it to us. And I think the next question naturally should be, in the Bible story, to whom does God do that revealing? Or within what context does God do that revealing? And the answer is always covenant. The answer is always covenant. God, through covenant, bridges the creator-creature gap so that he can enter into relationship with people, or to seal the relationship he already has with people. I'm arguing that I will be your God, you will be my people, across redemptive history is what covenant accomplishes. Robertson argues for what he calls the Emmanuel principle, that covenant accomplishes an Emmanuel principle, a God dwelling with his people. Across the covenants, you see this theme of, I will be their God, they will be my people. Right? We saw it already in Genesis 17, Genesis 17:7. Look at Exodus 6, 6 through 7. Say therefore to the people of Israel, I am the Lord. I will bring you out under the burden of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from slavery to them. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great acts of judgment. I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God. I will be your God. You will be my people. And of course, that's echoed again in Leviticus 19, right? And consider 2 Kings 11:17. The covenant established as an expression of God's ongoing relationship with Israel in the Davidic covenant. And Jehoiada made a covenant between the Lord and the king and the people, that they should be the Lord's people. They will be his people. He will be their God. Ezekiel 34:24 also echoes this in expression of the new covenant. And I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David shall be prince among them. I, the Lord, have spoken. When he talks about the raising up of David, the fulfillment of the Davidic covenant expressed within the new covenant, he does it with the same language. I will be their God. Right? And it's expressed not only in this declaration of I will be their God and they will be my people, but within that declaration is the understood reality that God's presence will be among his people. If God is to be their God and they are to be his people, then he will dwell with them. He's not to be their God from a distance. He's to be their God within their midst. Consider Exodus 29:45. I will dwell among the people of Israel and will be their God. Do you see that? I will be their God, they will be my people, and that's expressed through God dwelling among them. And where does he dwell among them under this covenant? The tabernacle, right? Part of them being God's people and him being their God is that he dwells among them. Or look at, in the New Covenant expression, Ezekiel 37:26 through 28. I will make a covenant of peace with them. It shall be an everlasting covenant with them, and I will set them in their land and multiply them. And I will set my sanctuary in their midst forever. My dwelling place shall be with them, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. So we're saying that's how God, the expression, I will be their God, they will be my people, is a covenant expression. And throughout the scripture storyline, that's always associated with God dwelling amongst his people. He's not their God, and they're not his people from a distance, but close and intimate, which is fulfilled in the presence of Christ, right? We already quoted John 1:14 earlier. He tabernacled among them. He was the tabernacle. Jesus was the tabernacle among his people. Revelation 21:3, we've already quoted that several times. At the end, it's declared, I will be their God, they will be my people, and there's no need for a temple because the Lamb is the temple, the presence of Jesus Christ himself. That's where all of this is going, right? So Jesus is the fulfillment, then, of God's covenantal expression to dwell with his people. The purpose of God's covenants is that they would be his people and he would be their God. And that's expressed in presence dwelling among them. And Jesus is the climax of that. Jesus is the ultimate expression of I will be your God and you will be my people, in that he dwells among them as Emmanuel, in that he dwells among them as the tabernacle. He is the one that all the covenants point to, and he is the climax of the covenants because he is the one through whom God's presence eternally dwells among his people. Does that make sense, that argument I'm making here? And so I'm making a broad argument then for Christ as the fulfillment of all the covenants because he is the one through whom God dwells with his people. And then we'll see specifically how he fulfills the different covenants. Well, let's start with this, a definition of covenant. A definition of covenant. Turn to the person next to you. Think through the different covenants of the Bible and try to define covenant. Try to define covenant with them. Okay, so let's come back together. I hope that, this is what I hope you felt there. First, it's like, oh yeah, this is going to be an easy assignment. Then you start to try to do it and you realize this is a lot more difficult than I first realized, right? So let me hear a couple of definitions that your group came up with. What is covenant? Yeah.
Simply put, a contract.
A contract, good. So like a business contract that I enter into with someone. Like there's a business decision that needs to be done. I sign it, they sign it, we're done, right?
It doesn't just have to be a business. It just
Okay.
means that two people come together for a specific mutual interest, and it's binding.
Yeah, it's a binding agreement that two parties come together and make an agreement with. Good, yeah. An alliance. Okay, that's good. That's an example probably of a covenant. Let's talk about contract. Did anyone else say contract? You guys said contract? Well, what I asked was, did anyone else say contract? So I want to hear what you have to say. In all seriousness, I want to hear what you have to say. But before we get there, I want to talk about the idea of contract. Okay, because this is talked about a lot in covenant. Is a covenant a contract? No. Does anyone say yes? Besides these guys? James says yes. So I do think a covenant is like a contract, but it's more than just a contract. It's like a contract, but it's more than a contract. What's that? Exactly. Relationship is involved. Because I can sign a contract with my landlord. I can sign a contract with any number of people, right? But a contract by itself is cold. It's just a sterile document that doesn't reflect anything of the way I feel about the person, right? So yeah, I think if we're able to blend these ideas of contract and relationship together, which you do much more easily in your culture than I do in mine, right? It's hard to think of an agreement in which there's not an implicit relationship that's being established, right? But yeah, a contract there's a relational element to it. Good. Now I'm going to broaden it up for more common sense questions. But yeah, any other ideas? Yeah. An agreement between two parties. Good. Yeah, something that either builds off of this or adds to it or contradicts it. Any other ideas? Yeah. That's good. So let me ask this question. So what you're hitting on is very interesting. Do covenants establish relationships, or do covenants secure existing relationships? Does everyone agree with that? Does it create a relationship, or does it secure an existing relationship? Do you understand the difference? Yeah, Mikey.
That's a confusing question because when God says on each covenant, like we just saw, when God says stay with me,
Yeah.
their God, that's
Mm-hmm.
the future
Mm-hmm.
fulfillment
Mm-hmm.
of the relationship,
Mm-hmm.
not an existing.
It's the purpose of covenant, right? Yeah.
So, but at the same time, there is that sense where, they are God's people.
Yeah, exactly. When did Israel become God's people? When he made a covenant with them, or when he brought them out of Egypt? Or were they already God's people, and that's why he brought them out of Egypt, right? So it can be for good ends or bad ends. But what I love that you're saying here is marriage as an example. I want to dive into that. So is marriage a contract? Yeah. But it's more than that. It's more than that, but not less than that. So let me ask this question. Does marriage establish a relationship, or does it confirm a relationship?
Both and?
Yeah, both and. We could say it like this probably. Marriage formalizes the relationship. Right? Like there's two parties that are in an existing relationship, but once the marriage happens, it's very clear who does what in the relationship, and for how long, and for what purpose, and until when, right? I think marriage is a very helpful illustration. You want to add on to that?
It also changes the relationship.
That's right.
Like in a single instant, it's not like you didn't know your girlfriend,
Mm-hmm.
but she wasn't your wife.
That's right.
And a second later, she is.
It changes the dynamics, doesn't it? Let me read you a couple definitions. I'm going to read you 4 definitions of covenant. We could talk about this all day long, right? Let me read you 4 definitions. And what I want you to hear from this is, I want you to hear, where does relationship and contract come in? And I also want you to be aware that this is difficult even for the smart guys. A covenant in the normal sense is an elected as opposed to natural relationship of obligation under oath. Okay. It's an elected, it's a chosen relationship under oath as opposed to a natural relationship under oath. So a natural relationship would be father and child, right? They didn't, that just happened. But it's a chosen relationship under oath. So I don't have a natural family relationship with you, but we are choosing under oath to enter into that relationship. A relationship with a non-relative that involves obligations and is established through an oath. Okay, that's one. Here's another one. The fundamental image behind each of the applications of covenant in the Bible is the use of familial categories for those who are not bound by ties or natural kinship. The coming together as family of people who are not formally family. Robertson says this: a bond in blood sovereignly administered. A bond in blood sovereignly administered. So a bond, meaning a contract, or you can read into that relationship probably. It's a little unclear. In blood, meaning it's a kind of a life or death thing, right? Like you break this thing, there are severe consequences. Sovereignly administered, meaning that who initiates the covenant? The person who initiates the covenant is in the relationship is not the person of lower status, but the person of higher status. So kings initiate covenants with people under them, not the other way around. Horton defines it like this: a relationship of oaths and bonds that involve mutual, though not necessarily equal, commitments. A relationship of oaths and bonds that involve mutual, though not necessarily equal, commitments. I think, and Gentry and Wellham in their Kingdom Through Covenant argue for marriage kind of as the foundational idea for what covenant is in the Old Testament. And a few of those definitions get to that. It's this coming together of contract, relationship, that formalizes the relationship. It doesn't create the relationship, but it formalizes the relationship. It tells each party kind of what their duties and what their jobs are and how they're to interact with each other, right? But not in a cold, contracty way, but in a relationship way. Does that make sense, what we're saying there? So let's look at a few observations about covenants. First, are covenants always explicit? Are covenants always explicit? Or we can say it like this: does the word covenant have to be in the text for a covenant to be there? No. AB says no. Does anyone say yes? Does the word covenant need to be explicitly mentioned for a covenant to be there? You think so? Okay. So people get hung up on, like, is there a covenant before the fall? That's what they immediately think of when they think of that. But here's what I want you to do. Go to 2 Samuel 7 and show me where the word covenant is used in 2 Samuel 7. What's 2 Samuel 7? The Davidic covenant, right? The establishment of the Davidic covenant. Show to me where in 2 Samuel 7 the word covenant is used. Yeah, exactly. Just like a pre-fall covenant is referred to in other places. But I'm talking about the establishment of the covenant. When a covenant is established, is it always explicitly called a covenant? That's what I'm asking. And we'll use 2 Samuel 7 as an example. 2 Samuel 7. James is already guessing it's not there. He's calling my bluff. Josh, stop being silly. Stop it. And he's right. The word covenant is never used in 2 Samuel 7. But is a covenant established in it? Yeah, it is. A covenant is established in 2 Samuel 7. And it's referred to elsewhere, right? So 2 Samuel 23:5. For does not my house stand so with God? For he has made with me an everlasting covenant, ordered in all things and secure, right? It's Davidic covenant. Look at Psalm 89, verse 3. I will sing of the steadfast love of the Lord forever. With my mouth I will make known your faithfulness to all generation. For I said, steadfast love will be built up forever. In the heavens you will establish your faithfulness. You have said, I made a covenant with my chosen one, and have sworn to David my servant. I will establish your offspring forever and build you a throne for all generations. That's directly quoting 2 Samuel 7. So other texts can tell us if there's a covenant there, if the covenant is being established, right? But the text itself doesn't have to explicitly say covenant for there to be a covenant in it. And 2 Samuel 7 is an non-debated example of that. Any questions on that idea? Yeah.
Maybe for it to be considered a covenant, even though it does not explicitly tell us in that text, if there is a reference to it being a covenant elsewhere,
Yeah.
we can take it.
I completely agree with that, yeah. For the most part. Though I think there are some examples of covenants that are not referred to as covenants elsewhere, but clearly covenant language is being used.
But then when will we stop it? Okay, then.
You're asking the question I'm about to ask, right? How do we know if there's a covenant or not? So I'm going to give you a few observations of what is found in covenants. And not all of these elements are always found in every covenant building text, but generally you're going to find most of these. Number one, obviously. What's that? Bloodshed? Not always. There's not always bloodshed. There's no bloodshed in the Davidic covenant being established. There's no bloodshed in the Noahic covenant being established, right? Covenant parties. Obviously, right? There's going to be covenant parties. We're going to know who the covenant's between, right? For the purpose of the relationship and the contract, we have to know who the covenant is between. If we don't know who exists in the covenant, there's probably not a covenant in that text, right? That's number one. Number two, obligations. There's obligations, usually for both parties. Usually both parties, there's an obligation for them. And with those obligations, there's rewards or penalties. Usually curses or blessings. And with it, so there's covenant parties, obligations, and within those obligations, two categories. One, rewards and penalties, and two, it's strictly binding. It's strictly binding. You can't just wiggle your way out of a covenant. You're in it. You swore. There's no getting out of it. And usually, lastly, it's conducted publicly, and it's expressed with a covenant sign. Right? It's not usually done in secret. And usually there's some kind of sign or signal or indicator of the covenant. Okay? So let's look at Genesis 15.
Could you define what you mean by public?
Yeah.
Like with David, it didn't seem public. With Abraham, it didn't. Like it was just a thing, right?
So, yeah, it's a good question. I think public, depending upon the appropriate context, is how it's done. Let's look at, and what I mean, public meaning there's a ceremony that's done that's obvious to people what's going on, but public also in that there's a covenant sign. Yeah, so. Yeah.
He gave them the law.
That's right, yeah. In the Ark of the Covenant, too, right? The Ark of the Covenant, most explicitly. Everyone knows there's a covenant, and how do you know we have the Ark of the Covenant dwelling in our midst, right? It's not something that's done secretively. I hope that answers your question. But there's varying degrees of publicity when covenants are done, especially in order to what's appropriate to the situation. Yeah?
In that definition, can we not say it is actually a contract, not more than that, but a subset within? Because there are contracts that are not binding by law, like we know, but
Yeah.
there are specific ones that are binding by law.
Mhm.
And these are the type of
Yeah.
contract that are binding.
I'm fine with thinking of it as a contract as long as we say it's more than a contract. It's not less than a contract, but it's certainly more than a contract because relationships involved, right? But I would say the penalties tend to be much more severe, and there's no way I can get a lawyer to wiggle me out of it. Let's look at Genesis 15, okay? So I want you to look for those elements in Genesis 15 and talk to your neighbor about it. Where do you see those different elements in Genesis 15? Okay, do you guys see these covenant elements in Genesis 15? Who are the covenant parties? Yeah, Abraham and God, right? Good. Now, I can't confirm this because I'm not an ancient Near Eastern scholar. However, Dr. Gentry, who wrote Kingdom Through Covenant, mentions in his book that we have no example in ancient Near Eastern literature of a God entering into covenant with people. The Bible exclusively does that. I haven't read all ancient Near Eastern literature. That man has a PhD in ancient Near Eastern literature, so I trust him. No other example of that. And we find God stooping down to enter covenant with his people here. How amazing is that? To bind himself to them eternally. That's what our God does. Good. What are the obligations? Yeah. Yeah, he'll bless him with 3 different things. Good, that's what's on God. That's good. That's what? The obligation, yeah. The obligation is on God to provide land, offspring, and blessing to Abraham. Good. What about the rewards and penalties? What about for Abraham? Will Abraham be penalized if he breaks the covenant?
He never went through the animals.
Yeah, he never goes to the animals. Why is that significant? How do you know that? How do you know that from the animals? Yeah, so God divided the animals, and he walked through them. Why does that matter? prove it. Look at Jeremiah 34, 18 through 19. I hear people reference this a lot, but they don't reference other texts that prove it, right? So what's being said here, I'm just putting you on the spot. What's being said here is that walking through the animals that were cut in two symbolizes, should I break the covenant, let this happen to me, right? But look at Jeremiah 34, 18 through 19. And the men who transgress my covenant and do not keep the terms of the covenant that I made before me, I will make them like the calf that they cut in two and passed between its parts. Jeremiah 34, 18. So God, the person who passes through the animals cut in two is saying, should I break my covenant vow, may this happen to me. May I be like this dead animal. Life and death is the reward and blessing. And who walks between the animals? God. However, in ancient covenants, it was not the superior who walked through the animals, it was the inferior. Good. And that leads to strictly binding, doesn't it? Oh my goodness, it's strictly binding. God pledges his life to this covenant. Is there a covenant sign? Is there a sign of the covenant? Yeah. Yeah, it says that he did. Yeah, the language is explicit. There's a covenant mention. So a covenant sign would be some kind of indicator, some kind of pledge, something that if you need to be reminded that the covenant exists, look at this. What indicates the covenant? What's the covenant sign in Genesis 15? Yeah, Emmanuel. I mean, the sign of circumcision certainly comes. But what about Genesis 15? Is there a covenant sign in Genesis 15? I think there is. No, it's towards the beginning.
Is it the offspring?
What about the offspring? What is Abraham?
The sign's not there yet, but if he has an offspring, that'll be the sign.
Look at verse 5. Look towards the heaven and number the stars, if you're able to. And he said to them, so shall your offspring be. I think the covenant sign, and I mean, it becomes circumcision, certainly. But in Genesis 15, I think it's the stars. If you want to be reminded of the covenant, just go outside and look. It's right up there. If you want something that builds your faith in God's faithfulness to his covenant, if you want something that stands as an indicator that the covenant will be fulfilled, the stars. The star sign serves as the covenant sign in Genesis 15. Now, certainly Genesis 17 makes circumcision the sign of the covenant. Because if you're concerned that God's not going to keep his end of the bargain, well, you're reminded every time you use the restroom and every time you clean yourself, and God is going to keep his covenant promises. God is going to make your descendants as many as the stars of the sky and the sand of the sea. Look at 1 Samuel 18. 1 Samuel 18, 1 through 5. Is there a covenant in 1 Samuel 18, 1 through 5? I'll read this to us. As soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David. And Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword, and his bow, and his belt. And David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him. So that Saul set him over the men of war, and this was good in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servant. What's being threatened? Why do they make the covenant? What is Saul? What's a little unclear about Saul? Yeah, so in the story, we're just reminding ourselves of the narrative, right? What's unclear about Saul?
Saul's the right king.
Yeah, if he's the right king.
Kingship
Yeah. And it's also unclear. Well, David's been anointed by this point, so for David it's clear. For Saul, it's unclear. It's a little unclear what Saul's intentions are with David, right? Is Saul going to kill David or no? And Jonathan and David both know this. So they make a covenant with one another. The covenant is that Jonathan is going to, well, let's talk about the covenant parties. Who are the covenant parties? Let's start with that. David and Jonathan. Easy, right? What are the obligations? In short, the obligation of the covenant, which we see played out later in Scripture, is that if Saul's going to kill David, Jonathan's going to let him know. Right? And we see that with the bow and the arrow, and if I shoot the arrow past you, then run. If I shoot it before you, then it's safe, right? And 1 Samuel 23:18 further indicates that there's a covenant made between the two of them, between David and Jonathan. And it has to do with David being king over Israel, verse 17. Saul knows this. Jonathan's explicit. And Jonathan is aligning himself to David. Yeah. Chapter 20? 1 Samuel 20? Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Good call. Good. So, what are the rewards and penalties? It's not as explicit here, but if you look at 1 Samuel 23:18, who do they make the covenant before? In 1 Samuel 23:18. Who is the covenant before? Before the Lord. They're bringing God into this thing. This is not just two friends pledging love and allegiance to one another. They're doing it before God. The penalties then would be before God. They're leaving those penalties and blessings to the Lord and not to one another. David's not going to harm his friend. Jonathan's not going to harm his friend. However, should they break the covenant, the person responsible for distributing punishment would be the Lord who they made the covenant before. Is it strictly binding? What event occurs that makes it strictly binding that we know? In the 1 Samuel 18 text. And this kind of goes with the covenant sign, actually. The covenant sign indicates that it's strictly binding. What does Jonathan do? He gives him his robe. He gives him his weapons. What did those things indicate? Saul is king. Who's next in line? Jonathan. So if Jonathan gives David the royal garments, the royal weapons, what's he saying? I'm not going to be the king. You are. You're going to be the king. And I'm giving you the things that indicate myself to be next in line. So then that becomes the covenant sign, the armor. If you want security in the covenant, if you want to remember the covenant, what do you look to? You look to the kingly armor that David is now wearing. That Saul, the rightful, or that Jonathan, the rightful king, the next in line, gives to him. Let's look at Joshua 9. You remember the story of the Gibeonites in Joshua 9? So here's the story. The people of Israel destroy Jericho. They destroy Ai. And after they do that, the Gibeonites hear and their hearts melt, and they are scared. What's going to happen to us because we're next? And so what they decide to do is they grab some moldy bread. They put it in a sack. They get empty, I believe it's wine jugs, or it's water or wine, I can't remember. Wine skins, either that or water, I can't remember. They get beat up shoes and beat up clothes, and they come to the Israelites, and what do they tell them? We came from a really far away country. Right? They really made it look the part too. And actually, they lived in the land. They deceive Israel. And look at verses 18 through 21 of Joshua 9. The people of Israel did not attack them, because the leaders of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel, that all the congregation murmured against their leaders. But all the leaders said to the congregation, we have sworn to them by the Lord. This is after it's revealed what happened. We have sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel, and now we may not touch them. This is what we will do to them. Let them live, lest wrath be upon us, because of the oath that we swore to them. And the leaders said to them, let them live. So they became cutters of wood and drawers of water in the congregation. Starting in verse 16, they made a covenant with them, as they heard, after they made a covenant with them, they heard that they were their neighbors, and they lived among them. Okay, so what are our covenant, our covenant elements, where do we see them in these texts? Who are the parties? Yeah, the Gibeonites and Israel, right? Yeah, good. What are the obligations? Not to kill, right? To protect. It's an alliance. In fact, in the very next text, the Gibeonites are threatened, and Israel comes to their aid. They have to, because the covenant's before God. The rewards and penalties aren't mentioned, but they're inferred, right? Because they swear before the Lord, just like Jonathan and David did. The penalties would come from God. And is it strictly binding? Absolutely it is, because they come to their side when the Gibeonites are threatened. But look at 2 Samuel 21. Now there was a famine in the days of David for 3 years, year after year. And David sought the face of the Lord, and the Lord said, there is blood guilt on Saul and on the house, because he put the Gibeonites to death. There's a famine that came on the land of Israel for 3 years. Why? Because Saul attacked the Gibeonites. Everyone had kind of forgotten about the whole Gibeonite thing. God didn't. Hundreds of years later. So the king called the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now the Gibeonites were not of the people of Israel, but the remnant of the Amorites. Although the people of Israel had sworn to spare them, Saul had sought to strike them down in his zeal for the people of Israel and Judah. And David said to the Gibeonites, what shall I do for you? And how shall I make atonement, that you may bless the heritage of the Lord? And the Gibeonites said, it is not a matter of silver or gold between us, and Saul or his house. Neither is it for us that any may be put to death in Israel. And he said, what shall I say that I shall do for you? And they said to the king, the man who consumed us and planned to destroy us, so that we should have no place in all the territory of Israel. Let 7 of his sons be gathered to us, so we may hang them before the Lord at Gibeah of Saul, the chosen of the Lord. And the king said, I will give them. Covenants are binding, eternally binding. And even though the Gibeonites were deceptive in how they created this covenant, but they still made a covenant before God. This has a lot to say also in marriages. I mean, as a pastor, you're going to have people who come and say, when we got married, she lied to me. When we got married, he lied to me. He said he had all this money, he has no money. She said she would do this. That was a non-negotiable. She said that she was like this, and I got married and she wasn't. Here's what I do want to note. 400 years later, God is still aware of the covenant, and he still enacts judgment. And I think we can make applications for marriage, but we can also make applications for this. How much more so will God remember his covenant he made with us through Christ? 400 years later, God remembers the covenant, and he's faithful to it, and he exacts judgment on Israel because of it. How much more will he, for 1,000 generations, because of the blood of Christ, be faithful to us, the members of the new covenant? And clearly this is made publicly because Joshua makes the covenant with the leaders, right? And we can trust that even though David wasn't there, Saul wasn't there when the covenant was made with the Gibeonites. However, the application of the covenant was still to them. We weren't there, my friends, when our Lord was crucified, and we were not there when He broke the bread and gave the wine, and yet the effects of the covenant still apply to us. And we are forever his offspring. We are forever his children, and nothing can undo that. The story of the Gibeonites gives us such hope.